This is one of my favorite gadgets, and now you can get most of the functionality of it for less than half of its price. Hey guys, if you don't know, this is a mechanical or motorized gimbal, and it allows you to stabilize any type of cameras, especially massive DSLRs. This is relatively professional equipment. It was quite expensive, and I used that in several different videos and a couple of productions I'm working on over the last couple of months. It's great. It has fancy features like removable handle that you can use it to control this remotely, but it's incredibly heavy and unwieldy and it takes a lot of space. And it's not the only professional style equipment that I've got. I also have a motorized slider, which I'm gonna use in this video to create stunning B-roll. But the subject of today's video is something even cooler, so let's move this aside. This is Hohem iSteady M6, which is also not a subject of this video. However, I took it to Marrakesh to test it and to create awesome memories and very nice stabilized videos. You can check it out in this video there. And the reason I have it in my hands because I wanted to talk about its biggest flaw. I mean, it's not a flaw, it's just a design choice. This clamp, meaning that despite having 400 grams of payload, I could realistically speaking only attach mobile phones to it unless I was willing to put in some CAD hours, design 3D printable adapters for whatever cameras or action cameras I wanted to attach to this gimbal, which honestly I'm not willing to do despite having really fancy water-cooled printers like this. Turns out I don't have to because Hohem has released this, and this is Hohem iSteady MT2, one of my favorite gadgets this year. As you probably gathered from what's actually fitted to the gimbal itself, it's made for more than just your phone. So let's talk about it. Despite arriving in pretty large box and a nice carrying case, the gimbal itself is relatively small. If you actually compare them side by side with the previous iteration, you'll notice two things. They're very similar in size and they feature the same design of the handle, something that we're gonna be investigating in a moment. But there is a massive advantage of actually getting MT2 instead because unlike the previous iteration of the gimbals, it supports various devices including mobile phones, action cams, compact DSLRs, and I'll be testing it with the cameras I'm using right now to film this video, Lumix S5, a proper DSLR camera. So with the release of the improved device, Hohem is actually providing with a single gimbal to handle all your stabilization needs. The question is, have they actually pulled it off? Obviously the answer to this question is yes, because I'm smiling right now and I've mentioned that this is my favorite gadget of this year. So let's try to quantify that answer. Apart from the gimbal, inside the box you would find the usual accessories, including this very handy tripod adapter, which doubles as a hand, making it much easier to extend the gimbal and keep it in your hands. You will also have various adapters to accommodate for fitting a mobile phone, GoPros and compatible action cameras, and different sizes of your regular cameras. There are also more cables that I could count on, and Hohem has included an AI module because this version is available with AI module and without it, just in case you want to save yourself a little bit more money. And you probably realized by now that the handles on both M6 and the MT2 look almost identical. So if you've seen my M6 video, let's talk about the problems or observations I have about the previous design and see if they actually fixed it. The first and most annoying observation I had was with the locking axes. This thing, that's the second observation. This thing has locks on each axis to prevent from this happening, but after a couple of days of use, the locks actually stopped working and it was virtually impossible to lock it in place. So that was a problem with plastic wearing off and, well, as annoying as that is, it wasn't stopping the gimbal from correct operation. The second issue being, well, the module itself, which is magnetic, but where it's positioned is incredibly easy to knock it off its place, drop it on the floor, damage it, or lose it. And since it's about 70 quid itself, it would be very expensive thing to misplace. I'm pleased to say that there is absolutely no way you're gonna break locks on this one. They have been completely redesigned, the arms are made of metal, and the whole thing is gonna be super durable. In addition to that, you can lock the camera in various different positions, allowing you to make this more suitable for transport. The second improvement comes with AI module and attachment. Now, while they haven't changed the design of the AI module, it's still a magnetic one, but the position of it, it's braced against a 90-degree angle, make it more sturdy and fixed in place and harder to accidentally be knocked out from its primary position. So in result, I've not once dropped it on the floor, which is definitely a great thing. And while I said that this is virtually impossible to destroy right now, I did manage to damage something. And the quick release plate for cameras comes with a small thumb screw, which has a small pin or tab that allows you to drive the screw with your fingertips. Well, I managed to break it off, and I would be personally more annoyed about it because now I no longer can use the fingertips to apply the screw and fit the plates to the camera. They also include magnetic tiny little screwdriver, and this is the best convenience ever because it's always there. I can always use it to untie and tie all the screws on the gimbal itself, on all the camera accessories that I own, and it's just a great simple little thing that I absolutely adore. Thank you very much. I will forgive you for that broken off tab on the thumb screw. So now that we know that Hohem improved on things, let's talk about controls. And if you've seen my M6 video, then you can skip this chapter because the controls are almost identical. So let's start on the left-hand side. You're gonna see this multifunction rotary encoder with a button, which is being used to control axes, highlights, and also focus pull on supported cameras. Next to it, we have two buttons, A and B, and those are responsible for time-lapse control. So you'll be able to start and set your time lapses using the buttons on the gimbal itself. Now on the front plate we have an OLED display which will display all the functions, letting you know what is the actual configuration of the gimbal that is set to, so it's basically easier to operate. Next to it we have a 4-directional joystick and a mode button, which if you press multiple times it will access different follow modes. Just below that we have a zoom control with a small tab that goes up and down and a record button that also can double as a button for taking pictures if you're going to hold it for longer. On the right hand side we have a USB Type-C port for charging and a power button. New on that side is also a 1/4-inch screw adapter for your accessories, so you can put extra handle on it, you can put extra light or whatever you desire. Now speaking of the mounting points, we have that port on right hand side, we have also one at the bottom that you can screw that handle in, and additionally there is one on the top which moves with the camera, so that's an ideal fit for either for a light or for a microphone. Lastly, we have a trigger release in here, and depends on how many times you're gonna press on it, it will allow you to set the gimbal in the different functions. Now speaking of the USB Type-C ports, now one we have here for charging, but there are two additional ports on the gimbal itself which enable a couple of things. First, there is a charging pass-through. Now I know the built-in battery with 2600 milliamps, which isn't great when it comes to charging your external devices, but you can use a external battery enabled charging pass-through through the gimbal to the camera, so that would allow your devices to live longer if you're concerned about the battery life. The second port is more interesting because it allows the controls from the gimbal to be used on the compatible cameras. Now unfortunately my cameras weren't compatible, and we're going to talk about it in a second. The gimbal itself comes with all adapters for the cameras, for mobile phones and for action cameras like GoPro and similar. And frankly speaking, the number of those plates was so confusing that I actually had to open the instructions to figure out which parts I need to use for what. But don't worry, once you assemble it a couple of times, you'll have absolutely no problem remembering which plate to use for what. Now, another good thing that I like, apart from everything on the top being made from metal, which is super sturdy, is the fact that each mechanism has a locking pin, so there is no way you will accidentally unlock one of the axes and let it slide out and damage your equipment. So that's a very good thing. And as you can see with this setup, I have a Lumix GX80 which weighs around 510 grams, and with the maximum payload of 1200 grams, you are able to add quite significant load to this gimbal. So we are talking about extra lights, a microphone, and whatever you really want to add on the moving parts of the gimbal. Obviously, if you're gonna use attachment ports that are on the handle, the weight doesn't matter as long as you're strong enough. The weight itself isn't, however, the defining factor, and the size will be also in consideration. When I firstly mounted this camera on it, I felt like the camera placement is ideal and everything feels really good in hand, but then I looked at my Lumix S5, which I'm using to shoot this video. It's a proper DSLR, it's much bigger, and it's definitely heavier, and I was wondering whether I'll be able to A, fit it, and whether it's light enough to be used on my new gimbal. This little gimbal is available from £279, and I know it might feel a lot, but if you consider that I spent twice as much on my other gimbal, which doesn't really offer that much more functionalities, then you're getting yourself a pretty good bargain. Now, on top of that, you can get AI module, which is also awesome. This little device allows you to do three things. First, it enables gesture recognition. This means that with a gesture like this, you can enable face tracking, you can stop face tracking, or with a gesture like this, you can change the frame in which this module is looking for you, allowing you to reframe the tracking mode. The last option is the built-in RGB light. Now this can either be white, warm or cold, or full RGB spectrum to provide extra highlight or illumination of your subject. It's not particularly strong light, but it's definitely gonna save you in a pinch, or it can provide very colorful and interesting accents to your photography or to your videography. Once installed with all the controls that I've got on the gimbal so far, it turns this gimbal into something actually really smart. I've used other gimbals from Hohem in the past, especially mobile gimbals, and they would require a mobile app to enable features like face tracking, object tracking, or advanced controls. And the cameras like this often have focus that can follow faces, so with this little device I was able to track a person and retain the focus on that person too. Super clever. And this is where all of this comes together, because suddenly I no longer need to have an Android phone connected to it or an app installed to have the access to advanced features of the gimbal. On top of that, do you remember when I mentioned cables? Those are split into two categories. First, we have USB 2 camera cables. If you have a compatible camera, which I don't, then you'll be able to control the camera functions directly from the gimbal itself. Stuff like focus pull will be suddenly available, and you'll be able to direct, and you'll be able to use your camera like a proper cinematographer, right? That's really, really cool. But if your camera isn't supported, then there is a second option which utilizes TRS cables. TRS cables are basically cables that connect to the trigger release. And while that won't enable advanced features like focus pull, you'll be able to at least use the trigger button on your gimbal to start recording or take a picture instead of mashing the buttons on the camera, which can be very, very awkward. And smart controls don't end up here. If you, for example, have a GoPro, compatible GoPro, you can utilize that Bluetooth connection between the gimbal and the action cam to take control of your action cam settings. Now that's going to depend on which kind of GoPro you have, but yeah, I'm going to refer you to the documentation of the gimbal itself and to the product's website. I don't have a GoPro device to test it, so I just have to take Hohem words for that. And if all of that wasn't enough, you can still use the mobile clamp, which is this time a metal and features extra attachment points, pop it onto your gimbal, add your mobile phone, and connect your phone via Bluetooth to the gimbal. And even without the app, you still have a control over the default camera functions like taking a picture, starting videos, swapping cameras, and settings. And if you require even more, you can download Hohem Joy app and enable feature like object tracking, which AI module doesn't support, and have fun with that. By the way, it's a good idea to have the Hohem app installed anyway because it allows you to update the firmware on your gimbal and set some basic parameters like, for example, the duration of your time-lapse, which unfortunately there is no menu in the gimbal that you can set. By default it's set to 1 minute and you can extend that to 1 hour if you want, but that is only possible using the app. I do realize it's a lot. I know all of this because I've been playing with my previous M6 gimbal in Marrakesh and I've learned all the controls, and trust me, it will take you a day or two and some instructions to actually memorize everything. But once you get familiar with controls, you'll notice that all of them make sense and the gimbal is super easy to use. So give yourself a time and don't panic if you don't remember which button does what. As the AI module enables tracking, let's talk about tracking specifically. First of all, it's the same AI module that's been used on the M6, so it comes with the same advantages and disadvantages. It's very easy to actually start tracking, however, once you have more people in the frame, this thing can get confused and it might lose the main target and jump from one face to another, which is not ideal. And yes, in theory you could outrun it if you're fast enough. I was definitely fast enough for that. But overall tracking is pretty good as long as there is a one person in frame. Now I had a one quirk in which once I've enabled tracking with a gesture, I had to reframe my image again so I could be kind of in the center of the frame, because by default the camera was pointing slightly too low to my preference. But once that was done, well, everything was working as expected. And here is a small advice or maybe small suggestion for Hohem. Now, I had to do it myself, which involves me obviously using two hands to use that gesture, which was virtually impossible while you're holding the gimbal. I mean, like, I only have two hands. I didn't evolve past that, even though I would really like a third hand. But if that function was actually available using a joystick, that would be super useful. So Hohem, jump on that and get it fixed, because that would be super useful. I guess it's time to talk about the most important aspect of this whole setup. The video stabilization. Now obviously the quality of your video is going to depend on what kind of camera setup you've got mounted to your gimbal. I've tried several different options, including my mobile phone, an action camera, this compact DSLR and the proper DSLR, which I wasn't sure whether it's going to fit on the gimbal or not. So with a mobile phone, it's easy. You deploy the metal clamp and within seconds you can have it in whatever orientation you want. The clamp set actually allows you to flip the clamp 90 degrees for more TikTok style or Instagram posts. So if that's your thing, then great. But you can also get to that position using the gimbal itself by simply twisting it. You will have limited motions that way in certain axes, but it's definitely possible. The similar principle applied to the action cam. Now, because both mobile phone and action cam is relatively light, there is absolutely no issues with it, and the motors are powerful enough to go through various different movements. So I quickly shifted my focus to the compact DSLR and the full-size DSLR, and to make everything interesting, I decided to venture outdoors and climb a mountain. Well, a hill, because it's only 300 meters and technically it's not a hill, but hey, that's the tallest thing around here and I'm proud to go on the top of it, right? Because you can get nice footage. Anyway, I took my Lumix S5 developer DSLR and this little camera with me, because this is kind of the perfect size of a camera that Hohem imagined would be mounted to this gimbal. And to be fair, it feels this way. With a camera that weighs around 500 grams, the gimbal feels perfectly balanced in your hand and you can move it quite swiftly across. The motors are powerful enough to provide excellent stabilization and even shoot quite interesting rotating shots. By the way, that rotating shots can go on forever. Because everything felt responsive and well balanced, I decided to actually risk it and take this on my bicycle. And to be fair, I am super impressed because the whole thing looks like shot on a drone. And when the camera was pointing at me and I was holding it in my hand, it's just one of the sweetest shots of me cycling I've got. Everything is crisp because I'm using a better camera, and the gimbal was amazing in keeping everything stable. I mean, it's just made for cameras like this. So whether I was walking on a flat terrain or climbing a mountain, each time the Hohem iSteady MT would be there to provide me with interesting footage. Encouraged by this, I decided to swap the cameras around and mount my proper DSLR. And with the zoom lens configuration, it was nearing the payload limit. It was just under 1200 grams of total weight. However, it wasn't the weight that I was concerned the most, it was the size. After fiddling for a moment and resizing all the clamps on my gimbal, I quickly discovered that it actually does fit, even though it looks ridiculous. Obviously, the entire setup becomes much more bulky, it's top heavy, and it's harder to kind of operate. On top of that, I was a little hesitant to operate 2,500 pound camera on this gimbal, so there was no way I would be taking it on a bike. I was just not feeling confident in my ability to keep this in my hand. Oh, scary. But if you're gonna take your time, balance this correctly and calibrate your gimbal, then you're gonna have a really good time, as all the gimbal options are gonna be suddenly available to a professional DSLR. Just bear in mind that with a heavier payload like this, you're gonna lose on some of that precision and you'll have much more momentum to control. So if you suddenly whip across the screen, don't be disappointed if the gimbal just gives out and you're gonna go out of bounds on one of the axes. There's not much you can do about it, especially if you have a payload like that. If you're using an action cam on a phone, you're definitely not going to come across this as an issue. So after the outdoor experiments with my big camera and the smaller equivalent, I came back home to check the footage, and honestly, it just looks great. I'm happy with it, and it's on par with the other gimbal. And yes, the other gimbal provides me with a little bit more security when it comes to a big camera, but with a careful planning, I should be able to use any camera I want using MT2, which I'm super happy about because, let's face it, this thing, when folded, is not particularly big and heavy to carry, so I'm going to take it with me to LA, where I'm going to actually play with it and make some cool footage. So yes, I'm looking forward to that. I hope you began to understand why iSteady MT becomes one of my favorite gadgets this year. Mostly because you can use it with everything and it will make my videography so much more fun and so much easier. I'm looking forward to using it for my YouTube channel as well, so you're gonna definitely see some footage being shot with the cameras mounted to this. That's a win. So if you guys are interested, then in the description of this video you're gonna find a link to this and to the M6 if you want to save yourself a little bit of money and get the mobile version. But as it stands for now, this is gonna be my go-to gimbal when it comes to the mobile phones, action cams, cameras, or even DSLR, as long as the space is the consideration, because yeah, this thing rocks. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. You know how all this thing works. I do not have a posting schedule, so if you want to know what's next, then use the YouTube tools provided. There's a couple of social media links listed on the screen right now, so consider following me there, start a conversation with me and let me know what would you like to see next. As for now, big thanks to Hohem for sponsoring this, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye! This is a Hohem iSteady M6 and This is Hohem iSteady M6 and I talk. This is also not the subject of this video. This is Hohem iSteady M6. This is iHohem. This is Hohem iSteady M6, which is also not a subject of this video.